multiple nuclear tones. We seem to do this particularly with high falls, or it's perhaps more noticeable with high falls. How many nuclear tones are there? Well, you'd think this depends on the number of nuclei, and this is going to depend upon the number of tone units, word groups, into which you divide the material. Well, that's true up to a point. And here again, there's quite a lot of freedom. If you're speaking fast, you tend to put a lot of material into one unit. If you're speaking more slowly, you tend to space it out. And in particular, if you're speaking formally, carefully, and slowly, before a large audience, you have a very large number of intonation groups, and therefore a very large number of nuclei. You've got a lot more material you can shove into the sentences. You really don't have time to think of what you're saying, because it's all coming out so fast. You want to shove it, you want to get it out into the open as quickly as you possibly can. You don't have time to make a great deal of intonation. However, quite apart from all of that, there is this possibility, it seems, of keeping something that seems like one single unit, but nevertheless seems to have multiple nuclei within it. So, example at the bottom here, we can get a sequence of high falls like this. She was absolutely right to complain. She was absolutely right to complain. Where we seem to have three high falls. She was absolutely right to complain. So again, a philosophical problem. Do we say, what we have here is three tone units, each with its own nucleus, each one being a high fall? It's surprising, seeing it's only one clause, but well, that can happen. Or alternatively, do we say, well, yes, this is one unit, but this is a special way of adding emphasis by putting in these extra falls, and that's all we need to say about it. And this really is an area where different people have come to different solutions. We've got a number of corpora that people have attempted to transcribe phonetically, or at least prosodically, to transcribe the intonation. And some transcribers want to recognize more groups than others do. The consensus is that although we can recognize an accent when we see one, we really don't always have clear criteria for recognizing a group boundary, particularly the group boundary where there's no actual phonetic pause. And I mean, this leads on to other questions, like, for example, is there a four-rised head? Some people reckon there is a four-rised head. I'm not disagreeing with you. Now we've got, I'm not disagreeing with you. O'Connor and Arnold would have to say that here we've got exceptionally two groups, the four-rised nucleus or not. I'm not, just sort of spreads out onto the not disagreeing with you. But on the other hand, because clearly there is a kind of spread from one to the next, I can see there's a strong case to say, well, really, this is like another kind of head. Maybe intellectually the distinction between head and nucleus, between one kind of accent and another kind of accent, is not very strong. Well, again, the point is that we have to somehow grapple with all this variety that's going on in real life and distill out of it something that can be taught to learners. And I think a lot of the disputes in intonation perhaps arise from this mismatch, this lack of clarity about what we're doing. Because on the one hand, there are people trying to transcribe actual recorded material. This is full of difficulties. Anything that's spoken may have some of the segments difficult to detect, difficult to hear. Even it's clear when we have these conversations recorded in real life, people can differ quite radically about what the people are saying to one another. And if you just do an ordinary orthographic transcription. Different people may have different views about what was said. I remember there was a passage in which Mrs. Thatcher was talking about the roots which underlie socialism. I took this as roots, R-O-O-T-S, the root of a plant. But somebody else, it was a postgraduate student transcribing this for a dissertation, identified this as the roots on the journey that underlie socialism. Now, you can justify either of these, but clearly different people listening to the same words can make a different inference. That's just the case of homophones and so on, but I'm sure the same applies in other areas. People may interpret the syntax differently, they can most certainly interpret the phonetics differently. They may not all hear the same intonation pattern, even given what the speaker said. There may be not sufficient data present to tell you whether it's a fall rise or a fall, or how much of a movement upwards do you need to identify it as a fall rise. There are certainly these problems like identifying where the nucleus is, how many nuclei there are, and how many chips there are. So we mustn't be surprised at the level of disagreement among scholars in transcribing authentic recorded material. That's quite a different issue from the question of what do we teach in the classroom. Because what we teach in the classroom has to be a subset of all of this. We do this in pronunciation, segments, we certainly have to do it in intonation. There are lots of things that happen in real life that we never teach the foreign learner. I mean, a good example in segments is the matter of smoothing. If I take a phrase like 2 o'clock, in real life, I usually say it's something like this, 2 o'clock. Now, we can have an interesting discussion about what happens to oo before a weak vowel. Oo tends to become for many people, myself included. But you don't wish to know this. This is not helpful for the learner to be told. If somebody uses his ordinary pronunciation of 2, and then o'clock, 2 o'clock, that's entirely adequate as a pronunciation for every foreign learner of English. It's also an accurate reflection of what many native speakers do, but some native speakers, including, I'm afraid, me, tend to mess around with it and alter the vowel. So instead of 2 o'clock, I say 2 o'clock. But we ignore that. For teaching purposes, we have to distill something that is teachable and learnable. This is even more true in intonation, where we need to choose out certain patterns. We certainly need to emphasize things like location of the nucleus. We need to get a good range of possible nuclear tones. We probably need to teach certain special things like question tags, greetings, and so on. We need to identify important areas where there's a difference between the learner's first language and English. But I think it's a mistake to think you must try and teach absolutely everything in intonation. Nevertheless, it's useful to have a kind of overview of it all, which is what I'm trying to give you.